Thanks for being here. We're going to read here from Judges, starting in chapter 2, verse 6. When Joshua dismissed the people of Israel went each to his inheritance to take possession of the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 111 years. And they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them and bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the ways in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of Israel was kindled against Israel, and he said, "Because this people have transgressed my covenant that I have commanded their fathers and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not." So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might not know war, to teach war to those who had not done it before. These are the nations, the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites, who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal-Hermon as far as Lebo-Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Ed. Again, welcome to Grace Press. We're glad you're here. We are beginning, really, our series through Judges, the book of Judges, working through it piece by piece. And again, why Judges? Well, because the theme verse of Judges is they were living in a land where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and the result was chaos. Absolute chaos. So I felt that this was a good time for today. If our country is not in absolute chaos yet, it's coming there quickly. And so the words of the Judges are not so distant as they might feel, even though they were these events occurred back in 1200 to 1000 BC. So again, when we look at this passage, we come face to face with judgment, God's judgment. And a lot of us tune our ears out immediately when we hear the word judgment, because it has such a negative feel to it. And so we hear the word judgment and we say, not for me, not my God, no thank you. But actually, have you ever gotten a chance to study God's judgment? To read the book of Judges or other places where you see God's judgment? Because it's actually much more nuanced, and there's purposes within judgment that if you just looked away the moment you heard the word judgment, you'd never see, you'd never get. And so today we're going to look at what this chapter teaches us about God's judgment. So we're going to look at, this chapter teaches us three separate things about judgment, God's judgment. And so we're going to look at it. It shows us the roots of God's judgment, what the judgment comes for. We're going to see the reasons for God's judgment, or another word could be the purposes for God's judgment. And then lastly, we're going to see the rescue from God's judgment, what he does to rescue his people from his own judgment. So the roots of God's judgment, the reasons for God's judgment, and the rescue from God's judgment. So the roots. What is the root cause of God's judgment? We saw last week that God had saved his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of these cruel and awful slave masters, and brought them into this land and said, hey, there's people here who are just as cruel as they were in Egypt. They cut off the thumbs and toes of people they capture, they enslave them, they extort them, they sacrifice their grown children even to these other gods that they serve. And so they're just tearing up the land, they're tearing up humanity. So drive them out, put them away, destroy their nations, get them out of here off the face of the earth. That's what they were called to do in the book of Joshua, and we saw that. Because they were so against life and goodness and love and justice. They wanted nothing to do with that. And so God sent them into the land to drive them out. And yet we saw they didn't. They left a lot of people around them from those nations. They didn't drive them out. They either left them and just kind of made them work for them, or they just couldn't even take it, and they left them. And so we see here that, well, we saw in chapter 1 that this half-obedience was the problem. They had left all of these nations, they left all of these child sacrificers, all of these torturers still in the land, and so God brought judgment on them. But here, we're actually given a different picture than chapter 1. The book of Judges actually has two prologues. It's like two introductions, two separate ones, and this is number 2. And rather than looking at the half-obedience of the people, it looks at what the root of that is. The half-heartedness of the people. Not just the half-obedience, but the half-heartedness of the people. That would lead them to half-obedience, and that would lead them to leave the people that they were supposed to drive out. And so we see this here when we look at this, that this half-heartedness which was within them. And the word that we get here, the concept that we get here is idolatry. This internal aspect here of half-heartedness. So read with me in verse 11. This is where we see the roots of it. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So that phrase, did what was evil, is going to be repeated throughout every major episode in the book of Judges. This is kind of the theme verse here, another theme verse. And they served the Baals. These were these Canaanite gods. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who'd brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods, from who? Among the gods of the peoples who were around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They drew out his anger, his wrath. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. So we see this half-heartedness. We see this, and as you see, actually, when we go throughout, they're not completely abandoning the Lord. So why would it say they abandoned the Lord? Because later on, they sacrifice to the Lord, and they do things, and they talk about the Lord, but they also incorporate these Baals and these Ashtaroth, these other names and religions and gods. Really what you see they're doing is they're going to multiple places to find what was only supposed to be found in God, and what truly actually is only found in God. They were going, when you ask, why would they do that? Why would they go to these other gods when God, they'd seen his power bring them out of Egypt? And part of the answer is the Canaanite culture was awesome. They came in on foot, these dusty, dirty, ragged Hebrews, practically eating sand for the last 40 years, and they walk in and they see what looks like Ballantyne or Uptown, these great structures, these great walls, and these impressive buildings, and this commerce, and they say, oh man, we have not seen anything like that, and this is what's available to us? This is the land that we're in? And so you can see now why they not only don't drive them out, but they kind of take them on. And their hope is that if those gods were able to do that for them, maybe they could do a little for them too. So they don't reject outright the Lord, but they bring in also these Baals and Ashtaroth. Now, some of you might see the problem with that. When you go shopping when you want to go shopping and get food, you go to Harris Teeter for some things, maybe. Maybe other things you can just find at Aldi. Maybe other things you can go up to Whole Foods and enjoy the double dark chocolate cookies. You can go to fill your need of food. You have your options, and you can go. But tell me this, how would your spouse feel about you going other places for love, for friendship, for affection? Tell me how your boss would feel if you walked in and said, hey, from here forth, I'm just going to go ahead and work half-time. Don't worry about the other time. I might do some other side jobs, but from here on out, sir, ma'am, I will be working half-time. Just letting you know. How do you think that would be received? Not so well. Why is that? Because this is not like a grocery store. This is a relationship. And we get that here, this picture, down here in verse 17. They whored after other gods. God uses that word prostituted. And so you start to get this picture that this is not just grocery stores, but this is a relationship with one who can provide and those who can't. And so actually when you see this, you get this vivid, visceral picture. Think with me for a moment about a prostitute. By the way, if you're a prostitute, you're welcome here. We want you to be here with us. But let's think about a prostitute here for a moment. He or she gives more than they get. Would you agree with me? They give their bodies, themselves, their lives even, in exchange for money or some short-term security or some short-term affections. But really, when you look at it openly, they give way more than they get. But they go from person to person, and they're used. And so God says, when you go to these other people, these other gods, for your security, when you go to these buildings and these centers of commerce for your building, for your security, or for your, proliferation, for your abundance, for your good. When you go to these other places and people for intimacy apart from me, when you go to them, really anyone else but me, you're going to someone like you would be a prostitute. You're giving more than you get back, and you serve them. We all serve something. We're made to serve something. And so God gives this visceral picture of what we're actually doing when we're going to other things besides God. God gives us spouses, God gives us friends, God gives us legitimate things, but they all come from Him. And when these people go to these other gods as if they could give, they are half-hearted. So Tim Keller is one of the pastors who is probably most well known with his understanding and teaching and application of the concept of idolatry, because we think of it as something very past, but it's actually alive and well today out there. It's alive and well today in here. Alive and well today in here. Because we might not bow down to little carved things, but we go to other people and places all the time for things that we need, for security, our job, for accomplishments. We look to pat ourselves on the back or to feel good about ourselves. We accomplish and we chase and pursue accomplishment. For comfort, we go to others, and who knows what. We go after other places. But here's the danger that he says. This is why idolatry today is so dangerous. Because today, idolatry enables us to continue as church members and feel like nothing is wrong. The greatest danger, he says, is not that we become atheists. The greatest danger is that we ask God to coexist with idols in our hearts. That's the greatest danger. And so he says this: how can we know if Christ is Lord of every area in our lives? How do we know? How do you know if you're an idolater? First, he says, look around you and identify the false gods of the culture around you. Just like these Hebrews were in the middle and surrounded by these false gods who worshiped the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Look around you and see what the people worship. If there is no God, what are people going after? Ambition, success, career, money, their children's careers, their children's success, you name it. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, all of the above. What does the culture go after? And then he says this. Second, we need to honestly look at each area of our lives, our families, our careers, our possessions, our ambitions, our time, and so on, and ask two questions of them. Am I willing to do whatever God says about this area? Am I willing to do whatever God says I need to be doing in this area? And am I willing to accept whatever God sends in this area? Am I willing to accept whatever God sends in this area? Basically, when two things come together, when it's God versus something else in your life, and God is the one that goes, he says this, where either answer is no, there is the area of our lives and hearts which we have opened up or already given over to an alternative God. That's the root of judgment here that we see in this passage. Not just half obedience, but half-heartedness. Asking God to coexist with other things as we chase them like prostitutes. So that's the first thing this passage shows us. The second thing is this. That we see the reasons for God's judgment. This is the nuance. This is the part, if you haven't studied God's judgment before, you can actually see what he does with it, what his aims are. And this already might be confusing you, that God would have multiple aims in judgment. So, one of the aims that we see here is this. It's simply a punishment. So read with me here. Verse 14, chapter 2. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. I don't use that word much except around pirates, but he gave them over to enslavers, to robbers, to these other gods, other peoples actually, who enslaved them. So he gives them over. He raises up these nations around them to come and attack them and enslave them. And why does he do that? What's the reason for this? Verse 15. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm. Why? As the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. God already said over and over and over. I'm the God who actually brought you out of slavery into freedom. I'm the God who actually provides you food, even though you have to go and get it yourself. I'm the God that actually provides you intimacy and friendship when all the other friends in Egypt abandoned you. I'm that God, the true God. Don't turn away from me and be fooled by the appearance of these other gods. If you do, I'll hand you over to them. If you want to touch the hot iron so bad after I warn you, I'll let you touch it and feel exactly why I warned you not to touch it. And so part of this is a judgment. Part of this judgment is as a punishment for specific sins. So recently, John Piper wrote a book. He's a pastor called Coronavirus and Christ. Thank you, Amanda, for putting that on my radar. And in it, he lists these, it's a short book, you should get it and read it. In it, he lists these reasons for why the coronavirus is happening. And he doesn't pull them out of his hat. He goes to places in Scripture and sees what reasons God brings difficult things on people for. There's multiple things. He lists just 6, but one of them, hear me, just one, not all of them, one of them, he says, is specific punishment on those who have utterly turned from him and rejected him. That's a tough pill to swallow. That some of those who are affected by the coronavirus, whether it's economically or health-wise, some of those people, hear me say some, it's not out of the question for that to be God causing that upon them because they have rejected the God of life. They chose death, and so they're getting it here. That's a tough pill to swallow, which is why the first rating and the highest rated review on Amazon is 1 star. And it says something like, God doesn't bring evil on people. I'm paraphrasing. You can go read it yourself. God doesn't bring evil. There is evil. He allows it and he uses it, but he doesn't bring it. John Piper brings up this example. He says, yes, okay, I get it. Not every thing that goes wrong in someone's life is because of their sin. Don't connect it one-to-one like some of the Pharisees did. And so we have in the Gospels this man born blind that Jesus and his disciples walk past, and they say, Jesus, who sinned, this guy or his parents? Like, where's the sin connection to his suffering? And Jesus says, neither. And yet in other places, we see, like in Acts 12. Herod, this great king, was in front of all his subjects, and they were all shouting, not a god, he's a man. Not a man, he's a god. Not a man, he's a god. And he goes, yes. And it says this. Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because, so here's the purpose again, the reasons for judgment. The purpose, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. So we see that some of the judgment around us is on specific sins. That's a tough pill to swallow of God's judgment. But if you want another reference for that, read the book of Judges. The entire thing is this cycle of God raising up enemies to consume them. And so Piper just says this: don't ask every time you're suffering. Don't connect every time you're suffering to did I do something wrong? But don't not ask the question: is there something in my life that I'm going after that I would rightfully deserve this? Don't always assume it, but be open to the question, to this concept. So that's one of the things God is doing, one of the reasons for his judgment. But there's another, and this one is surprising. Look with me here in verse 21. It says this: I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. I'll leave these enslaving plunderers right by their side. In order to, there's that purpose clause again, that purpose. In order to what? To test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. Okay, so he's doing something else than just punishment here. And again, look down a little bit and you'll see in chapter 3, verse 1. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war. Why are they being judged? What's one of the reasons for this judgment they're experiencing? So that they might know war. To teach it to this new generation that had not known it back in, what happened in the book of Joshua. So what does that mean? We actually see here that God is using judgment to bring about mercy. God is using judgment to bring about mercy. It was only in order that this new young generation that didn't know the Lord would know him. What does that mean? To teach them war. Well, everyone coming in the book of Joshua that we looked at, everyone coming into the promised land walked into these massive fortified cities that were guarded, and they had literally just probably some swords and spears, and I don't even know if they had horses, but the other people did, and they had chariots and they had walls. They couldn't touch them, and yet they were called into war. And what they learned from war was this: it's not the number of swords you have. It's not the number of spears you have, horses, chariots. It's whose God is on your side. That's what the people learned in Joshua, more than how to fight and know war. So when it says here, God left these nations, God brought up these conquerors around them to enslave them, that they might have to fight and know war. It's so that they would have to know and fight and see their own need for God's strength and turn to him. So even in judgment, there's this mercy that God gives of, you've been chasing after these enslaving idols that you give way more than they give back to you. They trap you in it. You go from idol to idol, and they give you nothing. They use you like a prostitute. And in that rock bottom place, I'm here. You can see me. I have not given up on you. That's what he's doing here in this judgment. This is the nuance of judgment, that it's, judgment, not that. I hate that. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. Well, there's an aspect of the difficulty of it, but there's also an aspect of mercy. And so it says this, Piper ends that section with this: why might this be fitting? Because in our present condition, after the fall, blinded by sin, we can't feel how disgusting and repugnant and traitorous our sin is against God. Hardly anyone in the world feels the horror of preferring other things over God. Who loses any sleep over our daily belittling of God by neglect and defiance? But oh, how we feel our physical pain. How indignant we become if God touches our bodies. We may not grieve over the way we demean God every day in our hearts, but let the coronavirus come and threaten our bodies, and he has our attention. He has our attention. Does he have your attention? Do you see the mercy in God allowing you to feel what you're chasing? So that's the reasons for God's judgment that this chapter shows us here. So we've seen here the roots of it, this half-heartedness, the reasons for it, but also, finally, the reversal of it. God himself reverses the judgment. He provides judges. Look with me in verse 16. They themselves couldn't fight these people. They were weak and scattered. There was no king in Israel to help lead them and gather them into an army. So it says here in verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. God raised up these people, and one author describes them, we don't think of judges as someone who sits in a courtroom with a gavel. This is more like a warlord, a military leader who raises up and fights these plunderers off and gives his people rest. This is God's own way of reversing and saving them out of the judgment that he brought them, because he has compassion. It says this, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. Why? For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. God was moved for his adulterous people. But here we go. We see here that already in the book of Judges, you're seeing a silhouette. You're seeing something incomplete, an incomplete reversal. Number one, it says here, look with me in verse 18. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them all the days of the judge. But, in verse 19, whenever the judge died, what happened? They turned back and were more corrupt, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. Every time this military leader died, his protection, his security died with him. And they were brought back into these nations and condemned again for it and given mercy. And this cycle goes over and over in Judges. So, number one, these judges, the reversal of this judgment is incomplete because the judge dies. And they need another judge. The second is this, all of these attacks are outward, and all of this deliverance that they give is outward. A warlord is a better term for it. What they do is they defeat all of these nations around them and give Israel peace. But can they change their half-heartedness? Whenever the judge died, they turned back. No. So it's not surprising that when Jesus steps on the scene so many years later and shows himself to be not just fully human, but fully God himself, and therefore not unable to die, he died, but able to be resurrected from the dead. And when people saw that, they flocked to him. That's not surprising, because so long this nation of Hebrews had their leaders die on them, and their protection and their shelter and their commerce and all of these things fall apart. And here's a leader who is over and above death, who's conquered death. So it's not a surprise that they would flock to Jesus. Second, it's not a surprise that when Jesus shows that he can not just conquer people by showing his power over nature and wind and any enemies, when they realize that he can not just forgive them for their sins, but also free them from their slavery, free them from their half-heartedness, from going to these things over and over for their security, their job, their children, their whatever it be. When he can save them from that so that they don't turn back, it's no surprise that people flock to him and still do. the surprising thing is this, that Jesus, the judge, became the judge to accomplish it. That's the surprising thing. That's the thing that no one gets. No one got then, and no one gets it today for the majority, is the way that God sends up this judge to accomplish this so that he would never die, his loving leadership would never end, is by the judge becoming the judged. The faithful becoming in the place of the faithless prostitute. What greater sign of God's compassion and forever loving, giving mercy is that? That is a judge worth following and knowing. I would encourage you, if you don't know this judge, that you find yourself chasing these other things, that you find an area, even if you do know Jesus Christ, if you have those answers to those two questions, am I willing to do about whatever God says in this area or sends in this area? If those answers are no, you are opening yourself up to or already giving yourself over to an alternative God. In this instance, don't be like the judges. Don't repeat their foolishness of touching the hot iron and seeing for yourself. Run to God's judge, his true judge now.